The first time I met Michael Powell, I was working as a camera assistant in the matte painting department on The Empire Strikes Back, the sequel to Star Wars, at Lucasfilm. I remember we were in the art department. I was there with Harrison Ellenshaw, the matte painter on the film, Richard Edlund, the visual effects supervisor, and George Lucas, of course. And all around the room, we had storyboards of all the shots that we were going to have to complete for the film, hundreds of shots. When a shot was finished, there'd be a big X on it. And unfortunately, there was only a few X's and so we all were kind of putting in long hours and feeling very tired. But when Michael came into the room, he just energized everybody. He has this infectious personality as a storyteller, as a filmmaker. And we had one of our new cameras that we had just built. It was a VistaVision camera, innovation in that you were able to look through the lens and see what you actually were photographing with a spinning mirror. That was a new technology that was being applied to traditional camera photography. And Michael Powell just loved that. He immediately looked through the camera and started lining up shots and started getting excited about doing a scene in the art department. And we were all a little bit tired and kind of overworked, and kind of seeing this guy just being so excited about being there. It was a great reminder for me to keep in mind that what you're doing is exciting, and to have that kind of sense of wonder in your work so that you don't get too jaded about what you're doing. Michael would also come and show his movies because they weren't generally in release. They were difficult to see back then. Back in the 80s, it was before we had DVDs and Blu-rays. But he was able to get prints and show his movies in our screening room and would take questions from the audience. And so when I saw A Matter of Life and Death, it was there the first time with Michael. Of course, it was called Stairway to Heaven because that was the title of the U.S. release. Not being so familiar with his work, I said, Michael, is there a kind of a philosophy or a type of story that particularly interests you as a filmmaker? And he said that he liked stories that worked on two different levels, meaning that there's a basic narrative, but then there's something underneath it that you can also experience and understand. And that's obviously in A Matter of Life and Death. You can view the film as a hallucination of the pilot David Niven who needs an operation. That could all be reality, or you could enjoy the fantasy aspect of it, that perhaps there's this other world where there's heaven, these wonderful, amazing experiences that you could have off the earth. So it functions on two different levels, and I think that kind of sums up Michael Powell's movies for me.
Even the main titles of the film are quite intriguing.
This is the universe. Big, isn't it?
There's the voiceover, of course, that it kind of portends that this is going to be an important film. And the galaxy and the stars moving gives us a feeling that this is going to be artistic.
Where there are no stars, it appears as dark, obscuring clouds.
Main titles are an opportunity to set the scene. They're not used that much anymore, and I think it's a little bit regrettable because you're taking away an opportunity to grab the audience, to make them, start to pay attention.
It's amazing that on A Matter of Life and Death, there are so many talented people starting out, especially in the camera department. You have, of course, Jack Cardiff, a lighting cameraman, who would go on to work with Michael Powell on Black Narcissus and The Red Shoes. And here's Cardiff next to the Technicolor camera with his cameraman, Jeffrey Unsworth. Or actually, he would go on to work with Stanley Kubrick for 2001, or Richard Donner on Superman. So you had a really amazing group of people who would go on to have very long careers. Michael Powell was very interested in what we were doing at Lucasfilm because he was very interested in making a movie based on Ursula Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea. And he wanted to sort of get up to speed on what some of the latest innovations were. And it's unfortunate that he never got to make that movie. I read the script. It was actually quite good. And it was kind of very much a precursor to the Harry Potter series. It had a school for wizards and lots of transformations between humans into animals. It was really quite good and way ahead of its time. I was, of course, very interested in the visual effects that were in A Matter of Life and Death. And when Michael Powell came to talk with us, I would ask him about his matte painting crew. And since that's what I was doing for Lucas with Harrison on Empire Strikes Back, Pal told me about Percy Day, who was the chief matte artist that he worked with on all his films. He referred to him as a technician, and then he corrected himself and said that Percy Day was a miracle worker.
I first met Michael Powell, and at the same time I became aware that my grandfather, Walter Percy Day, had had such an influence on Michael Powell's filmmaking and life. They'd worked on so many films. Now, Michael Powell started to tell me this when he came to visit ILM. My grandfather was known as Pop or Papa Day, and he received a great amount of respect from people at the studios. I didn't realize, but in my father's library was a book. It was actually a novelization of A Matter of Life and Death. And it's inscribed to my grandfather by Michael Powell, and it said, "To the greatest wizard in films from his most faithful novice, September 1946. And that really touches me. It's very valuable to me today.
By the time I was working in matte painting, and of course that was the traditional aspect of matte painting, was actually painting on glass to create scenes that would appear in the movie. And now it's evolved into digital. But my experience was basically to try to make the imagery look as realistic as possible. A photoreal is what we're trying to achieve. An illusion that looks like you actually photograph something. The matte paintings that were in Michael Powell's films have a little bit more of a storybook quality to them. They're a little more suggestive, a little bit more artistic. They're more interested in sort of expressing an idea or a feeling than sort of strict realism. And I think that that freedom is why I enjoy seeing them so much, because they create sort of this emotional feeling along with the imagery that I think is very powerful.
Percy was unique in a lot of ways from other matte artists at the time. And he did have a style. Now, that's something you don't necessarily want to be too obvious, because if it's stylized, then it looks like a painting, or worse yet, looks like an illustration in a book. And that's not what film is usually about. He came from a background of doing very staid Victorian-type portraits, but he was able to kind of modify that. As a matte artist, you have to fit into the style of the scene. Painting so that the film camera, the emulsion on the film, the lens, all those things taken into consideration. And then the final link in the chain is the projection of the film onto a screen.
It's interesting to note some of the other films in the genre that established this alternate reality of going to heaven. Films like It's a Wonderful Life, or a World War II similar film of the time, A Guy Named Joe, which also deals with going to heaven. But in those films, usually heaven is depicted very simply. In the case of A Guy Named Joe, it's really a bunch of dry ice out on the set with the characters walking around. In A Matter of Life and Death, the production designer, Alfred Junge, went into a very realized depiction of heaven. The sequences of the waiting room, where if the soldiers have just died, they would come to this area that had a very sort of stylized look to it, sort of futurism and almost kind of a Bauhaus look to it. Very minimal lines, very futuristic, lots of use of new exotic materials for the time, like plexiglass and things like that. And it's just a beautiful vision of this other sort of dimension. And it's interesting to see that it relates to some of the earlier films like Metropolis. And I know that Junge was working at UFA when Metropolis was being produced. So he didn't work on it directly, but he was working at the studio. So he probably had a chance to visit the sets and to see that film. So that kind of futuristic, modern look to heaven, I think, was a very bold and interesting choice for how those scenes were depicted.
Proper flap, eh?
Yes.
At a certain point, there's a sequence where they look down into the records office and the clerks filing papers and things in the filing cabinets. The way they did that was they had built a circular set piece that allowed the actors to view a miniature, which was a 12 by 12 foot model tabletop of the filing cabinets and people walking around. There's actually a little bit of animation down there. There's little puppets being pulled on string. You can see it in the movie. But it's all shot at the same time. The set piece, again, is a mixed scale so that it's actually a 12 by 12 section underneath that window that they're looking down on. So that allows the camera to move along with the characters and actually view that scene as one piece. It's a nice little sequence, and you can tell, again, that it was designed very much by Alfred Junge and executed based on his design, because his sketch looks exactly like what's in the film. One interesting visual motif in A Matter of Life and Death is this idea that you're looking down at something, you're looking down at the earth, or you're looking down at somebody doing something.
Surveying your kingdom?
The village doctor has to know.
This is established in the camera obscura sequence, when the characters are looking at a circular shape and viewing the village, which is similar to the records office scene. So there's some wonderful visual connections that are being reinforced all the way through the film. This is, storytelling at a very high visual level. And whether or not that's completely obvious, it doesn't really matter. It's there for you to observe if you want to be affected by it. And if you don't notice that, it doesn't really matter. But it's there if you want to see some depth to what the filmmakers are trying to say to you. For media, Junge would have used Conte crayons and charcoal for the black and white sketches with a wash, and then for color, gouache and watercolor. His black and white sketches are beautiful. His color ones are even more incredible. God, I would just love to have one of these sketches. They're so nicely done. But the secret of it is that he could work very quickly. And if the director wanted a change, he could satisfy the director's need for a change very quickly by revising a new sketch. So in this photograph that Junge took on the set, you can see the matte painting camera photographing through a piece of glass. And what's on that piece of glass is what we call a black mat or mask that's holding back part of the scene and reserving it for a matte painting that Percy Day would then add to the finished shot. And this technique, which Michael Powell referred to as topping off the set, allowed them to create their establishing shots with more scope and visual impact.
English filmmakers use different terms. Topping off the set is what we call a set extension. You build the set up 10 feet or 12 feet, and then use a matte painting or sometimes a foreground miniature to extend the set. Now, extending the set makes more sense to me as an American than topping off the set, but topping off the set sounds so much better.
Alfred Junge, before he worked in film, worked in Germany in the opera house, painting backings, big scenic backings that would be behind the various operatic scenes, and he also worked in the theater doing that work. So he was well versed on how to create backings, and there's some excellent examples of that technique in the courtroom sequence, where they wanted to depict this amphitheater with literally room for everyone to observe the trial. And so there are rows and rows and rows of extras in uniform, but at a certain point, the real people stop and a painted backing of people continue off into the distance. It's very bold, and of course, Junge would have been trained in this technique. So here you see what they photographed on the set, and then at a certain point, there's literally a plane that slices out, and a painted backing of those people are continued off into the distance. I sort of stared at those shots to try to figure out how they were done, and it works really, really well. I was really quite surprised. There's a little bit of smoke on the set, so the blend is a little bit soft. It's a quick shot. It's a static shot. Obviously, you couldn't have moved the camera because then the perspectives wouldn't have lined up. But for these particular shots, they work really, really well.
When I see that shot, I think, I wonder how many bit players, extras, they had to hire. And then I think, and you may laugh, do you hire them for the full day? Then you got to get them lunch. I mean, the practicality of filmmaking sometimes is just overwhelming. I'm not sure if it's a matte painting. I think it might be a backing, but it's a wonderful backing. And the join is perfect. I can guess where the join might be, but I'm sure I'm not 100% right. It's so well done.
Alfred Junge would do a representation for every major shot in the movie. Certainly anything that has a design component, he would be illustrating and showing to the director as part of an approval process for what the film would look like. And this was very much the way that Alfred Hitchcock would work. He also designed his films very thoroughly in the art department before actually going out on the set. And you can see why the production designer would be involved in this, is because he is designing the set. And so if you design the set, you're obviously going to want to think about where the camera should be photographing that set. So Junge would have put an X on the spot of where the camera should be. And I remember hearing from Michael Powell that when they were doing Black Narcissus, that I think probably Jack came more into his own, this being his second film with Michael Powell, that he sort of objected to some of Junge's ideas, and they would have to essentially work together. But just think of the results. I mean, two strong creative personalities coming together, and whatever they find as a compromise is going to represent the best that both can contribute to creating the scene.
I'm a big fan of Technicolor color, how that print looks, how the saturation of the colors is, how it looks a little hyper-real. Jack Cardiff was an incredible cinematographer, one of the real pioneers in establishing the Technicolor look without making it too much like jelly bean lighting, where everything is just, because they had to use a lot of light. But he could give it a certain ethereal look, a glow.
The Galactic Courtroom sequence is sort of the high point of the movie for me. It's this huge set, and behind the characters, behind the jury and the judge, they would have this light effect, this kind of shimmering, undulating light behind them. And the way they achieved that was they set up very large scrims, which are probably made of silk or some sort of material that's semi-transparent. And then they set up these very large arc lights and reflected them off of mirrors so that they would reflect on this scrim and allow them to get a kind of an animated effect behind the characters. Cardiff talks a little bit about it in his book. He said that he wasn't quite as satisfied with the effect as he had hoped, but you can tell that it is giving this kind of ethereal sense to the sequence, which I think is a great contribution. So one of the visual tour de forces is the transition from the sequence where we leave the Galaxy Court and go back to Earth for the sequence of the trial in the operating room. And it starts with this sort of incredible powers of 10 pullback. And Percy Day would paint this amphitheater. It would then dissolve into a galaxy, which would be another painting of color. Eventually going down to this giant staircase and then onto the actual operating table. That sequence is put together by the special effects department. Now, Junge obviously designed every aspect of this, and you can see his sketches were followed very closely by Percy Day when he painted them as matte paintings.
As you get to the end of the film, there's a lot of loose ends to wrap up. The whole narrative of death and halfway in between and love, and it's all supported by these incredible visuals. But as important as visual effects are, they need to fit within the whole rhythm and flow of a narrative piece. How long is that pullback? How far do you go back? What's the beat? And that's what impresses me. It gives me chills when I see the end of that movie.
So a major part of the film is this giant staircase, and they created it with different techniques. The first part was a full-size construction, which was 20 feet wide, had 106 steps, and was motorized with a 12-horsepower engine so they could actually go forward and reverse and stop. a full-size construction, 1-to-1, and they called it Ethel. Then they also had a miniature version of this staircase, which was much longer because they could make a much longer staircase as a miniature as it was much smaller. It's a quite stunning visual sequence. There's some technical issues with how the compositing was done at the time. It's very difficult. All the techniques weren't quite figured out yet, but just for drama and effect, it's a wonderful sequence. As a story point, they often reference these giant statues of Socrates or Plato, and the statues are not 1-to-1 scale, they're smaller than full size, but they're closer to the camera so they look bigger. If you keep the angle and the perspective correct, you can make objects that are smaller combined with a full-size background. It's not an optical effect. It's actually shot at the same time as the production is shooting the scene. It's just that the miniatures are closer to the camera lens, and you can see some stills, which were taken on the set. If you look at the top of the frame, you can see the statues are just hanging in the air. That's because from the right angle, they're lining up perfectly to sit on either side of the staircase. So it's called the mixed scale or hanging miniature technique, and that's how many shots were created that way. Here's a photograph of the miniature set, and you can see the scale of the staircase is quite large. There's going to be sculpted characters riding the staircase because it's going to be motorized. As the camera pushes toward it, we then dissolve to a scene of the film showing how it looked composited with the galaxy background. Again, this was a concept designed by Junge. His sketch was followed exactly by Michael Powell for the movie. And you can see that it's this bridge between fantasy and reality where, yes, aspects of the operating room are real, but the walls have been painted with galaxies on them. So there's this wonderful kind of half realism, half surrealism, magical moment in these sequences that are so exciting to see. I mean, you just look at that and you go, what a great idea to make that transition. What a great execution of an idea. Very subtle. It's not in your face. It's just a subtle little invitation to be inspired and amazed by.
What facilities do you wish?
One of the important things in the transition between the heaven sequences, which were in black and white, and the reality of Earth in color, was this transition of going from color to black and white and how that was done. The Technicolor camera used 3 strips, which is the red, green, and blue records to create color. It was a very difficult system to use at the time. It produced wonderful results, but it did require a lot of light and a lot of special consideration to make good scenes. They came up with the idea of starting with a monochrome look using the Technicolor camera through a timing process. So the very beginning of those transition shots are actually in color, but they're monochrome color to look like they're black and white. And then the color dyes would fade in for it to become full Technicolor. That was done with the Technicolor camera. Then for the rest of the sequence that was photographed in black and white, they would use a standard black and white camera.
At the very beginning, with the logo of the archers, which is actually a target and an arrow hitting the bullseye, it goes from black and white into color, kind of cueing you to think that this film may be a little bit of each, or why did they do that? So that's one of the things that kind of hangs back in the viewer's mind as you proceed through the movie, always leaving you a little bit off balance.
Another visual effects shot that audiences respond very well to is the scene in the operating room when there's a glass door, 12 glass windows with mullions, and the characters actually walk through them because they are sort of like they're ghosts, although the idea being that they're not really there and they don't have a physicality in their environment. So it's a nice fantasy piece that reaffirms the narrative of the story. It's very fun to see, but it still supports the idea that these characters are perhaps there through some sort of hallucination versus a real-world experience. So the way they did that is they photographed the scene normally without the sliding door in place. The actors just came forward, did their scenes. They walked from the background to the foreground and didn't worry about the glass door being there at all. Then after the set was cleared, they shot some photography of the glass door back in place, and they matted that door into the scene to make a composite. Then it was up to a rotoscope artist, which was somebody that would make custom mats that would draw the reveal section of when a character walks through the mullions. So basically they knew where the door was going to be, and they just would then observe as a person walks through that door shape to make a mat for them as they cross through the frame. It's a nice little technique, and I think, again, audiences respond to it very well, and it's a fun little thing to do.
I cannot read you. Cannot read you.
So the beginning of the film, when David Niven is in the damaged airplane that's about to crash, that appears to be a real Lancaster bomber. The film was made just after the war, and they probably were able to buy a Lancaster bomber, or perhaps have one surplus, because they made 7,000 of them for the war. So they would have cut the front section off, and we see in the set photos that you have the front of the plane with a Ritter fan, which is a big fan that they can blow smoke and dust through, an atmosphere, and they had practical fire effects going on. It's really a great sequence, and really what a great way to start a movie. I mean, it just grabs you, that opening scene, as being something that's very realistic and sad and frightening, which is just probably one of the best ways you could start a movie ever.
These days, it would be much more complicated. There would be smoke going by, and then there'd be all sorts of jiggly camera work, and, everything added to it to make it look like a crash. Here, the filmmakers bring out the set, tied off the camera, put flames in front of it, and go. And it works. It's almost uncanny. But I accepted it at the time because it was drawing me into the movie. And you cut away to Kim Hunter, and she's got just a little bit of her face slit, and she's just got a little bit of a microphone here. And there's nobody else around her. And again, it's just one setup. Very simple. And the cutting back and forth, it just works. It's amazing.
I think what's really interesting about observing the work that Powell and Pressburger did was it's a very unique period of time in British cinema where they were creating their own view of storytelling. It was a very British-centric storytelling idea, very different than what the Americans were doing. They had their own unique style that was theirs. And because they were dealing with subjects that often went into fantasy or to alternate realities, they tended to use visual effects. It was unusual for the time, and so we only have a few of those movies that we really look back at and enjoy as classics.
You see, over the channel, we ran into this ruddy pea souper. Aha. Oh, excuse the language, ma'am.
A Matter of Life and Death has the fantasy elements as part of its story that is interesting to me because it's an opportunity to really do fun things with the visual effects crew. They had a lot of dynamic, visual, impactful sequences. In something like Black Narcissus, it's much more real world. I mean, it's basically the monastery is there, and it's about whether that looks realistic or not. And there is an emotional component to it, but it's not really getting into the fantasy in the way that A Matter of Life and Death does. To be able to visualize heaven and have that as part of your story is really fantastic. It's a construction of what that would look like.
But what are these love affairs, Dr. Reeves? Men and women, thousands of miles away from home.
At some point, you kind of go, well, why is this important, and why am I watching all of this? Well, because it's about our own mortality and our fear of falling in love, deeply, madly in love, and then you're taken away. He thinks he's lost the love of his life, when in actuality he hasn't. And that dynamic keeps us fascinated.
How did you get here?
Most important in any film is relatability. How does it touch the audience? How does it touch each individual? And if you don't relate, you're not going to be interested.
What is so exciting for me about seeing the Michael Powell, Emmerich Pressburger films is just the sort of fantasy aspect to it, the complete use of storytelling dramatically. We were working on The Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars. I was sort of part of the generation that was bringing those kinds of movies back, meaning before that, many films were very realistic, and the fantasy aspect we hadn't quite gotten back to yet. So looking back at what Michael Powell was doing was always very exciting for us because he did it so well, and he influenced so many of my generation based on those movies. I think you'll find movies today, especially if there's a fantasy element, a transition from real world to fantasy, you're always going to be thinking, how did other people do it? And the examples that Michael Powell showed in his movies did it so well, it cannot help but be an influence to future filmmakers.